Down economics. Richard Di Natale with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. My name is David Spears. Government intervention is certainly the flavour of the month right now, but unlike some coalition MPs who want the government to intervene by building a taxpayer-funded coal-fired power station, our guest today is not such a fan of coal, but he is calling for government intervention in the banking sector. The Greens leader, Richard Di Natale, joins us today. In the wake of the Greens defeating the Batman by-election, he's putting some new ideas on the table in his speech for us this afternoon. I should just note, before I hand over to him, that we've already had the Labor leader addresses this year here at the Press Club, the Greens leader today, we have the National Party leader in a couple of weeks, Michael McCormack. The Prime Minister is always welcome to join us here at the National Press Club as well. But for this afternoon, please welcome Senator Richard Di Natale.
Thanks so much, David. Let me begin by acknowledging that we're meeting here on the land of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I acknowledge that this land was stolen and that sovereignty was never ceded. Also like to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues. It's wonderful to see you all today, and of course members of the press gallery. I last stood here a year ago, and if a week is a long time in politics, then a year is an eternity. In the last 12 months, we've seen the Prime Minister lose the last skerrick of policy credibility in jettisoning everything he ever believed to appease forces in his fractured and divided coalition. He was dragged kicking and screaming to change marriage laws and to hold a banking royal commission. His only economic policy is to give tax cuts to corporations and overseas investors, and he doesn't seem to have any agenda apart from his own personal ambition and the self-interest of the already rich and powerful. Over the course of the last year, the Greens were political geniuses after winning our first seat in Queensland's Parliament and electing the first Aboriginal woman to the Victorian Parliament, but apparently a few months later the reverse is true because of the results in Tasmania and the Batman by-election. According to some, the South Australian election result marked the end for minor parties. This despite the fact that the minor party vote reached nearly 29% in South Australia, a record high. That doesn't sound like the end of minor parties to me. Beyond electoral contests, the Greens have continued to build on our big wins in the Senate. Over recent years, we've made Senate voting more democratic. We've reversed Howard-era policy by increasing the pension for 170,000 people at the bottom while reducing it for those at the top. That's good old-fashioned redistribution in action. We've passed laws to crack down on multinational tax avoidance, and we stepped in to resolve the backpacker tax at a time when the Parliament was embarrassing itself. Now, we know that negotiating to improve government legislation can come at a political cost, but we take our role in the Senate very seriously. We consider each piece of legislation on its merits, we seek evidence to inform our deliberations, and we provide much-needed accountability. In a chamber that has been through so much turmoil, so much disruption, our role in the Senate, the Greens' role in the Senate, has never been more important. Perhaps most significantly is that it is the Greens who have been setting the progressive agenda in this country. Take marriage equality. For the Greens, the historic passage of that legislation late last year was the culmination of decades of community campaigning and legislative activism. After opposing John Howard's amendments to the Marriage Act in 2004, passed with the support of the Labor Party, it's been the Greens who have sponsored or supported all 22 bills for marriage equality, and after a very, very long time, after a long wait, the Labor Party and a significant portion of the Liberal Party have finally followed suit. We welcome that change. Similarly, we've been campaigning for many years on the rights of terminally ill patients to have control at the end of their lives through voluntary assisted dying laws, and for harm minimisation measures such as supervised injecting rooms. Both of these green ideas are now a reality in Victoria. And mark my words, it won't be long before one of the old parties joins us in supporting our campaign to change the date we celebrate Australia Day on, to mark a real change in our relationship with our First Peoples. This is an important step on the pathway to treaty or treaties with Aboriginal people, to lasting justice, and to have a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Let's get moving, and let's get moving quickly. The Greens have also led the debate on economic issues as well. We drove the case for a levy on the big banks to compensate for their implicit banking guarantee, a government guarantee, a policy that the Turnbull government, that's a bit Freudian, adopted during the last budget. We were prosecuting the case for increasing our public expenditure on infrastructure, on nation-building projects, on public transport, well before Scott Morrison came up with the notion of good debt and bad debt. We led the charge on closing superannuation tax breaks. The Banking Royal Commission would not have happened had the Greens not spent years arguing the case and then pushed hard in the Parliament on a parliamentary commission of inquiry. We were a lone voice until the Labor Party and the Nationals jumped on board. Labor's now adopted our policy to tax trusts as corporations and has gone part of the way towards emulating our policies on negative gearing and capital gains tax reform. We welcome that change. Even reforms to franking credits, another Greens idea, was adopted and later modified to address the concerns we expressed with Labor's proposal. The list goes on and on. Now, we might not get credit from all of you folks. There are, of course, some exceptions. I know Peter Van Onselen has argued the case as the Greens leading the economic agenda, but mentioning him by name is probably a bad career move for both of us. But look, ultimately what we're here to do is to see our policies implemented. That's a form of success. We know that having other parties adopt your policies can make the progressive space suddenly appear a little more crowded. We know that. But I'm reminded of what Petra Kelly, founder of the German Greens, used to say. The old parties put their green spots on in opposition and they shed them in government. Ultimately, what sets the Greens and our progressive agenda apart is that no party has accepted the central challenge facing humanity, that without a healthy environment, there is no economy. Those two things are intimately connected. It's only the Greens who fundamentally oppose trickle-down economics, an agenda that touts privatisation, deregulation and free trade at all costs. And it's only the Greens who place care for our environment and reducing inequality at the centre of our decision-making. We know that blind faith in markets and business is misplaced. Big business benefits from the rules that they are writing themselves, and Australians are left with the reality that wealth doesn't trickle down, it flows up. Indeed, sometimes it rushes up. Our communities are becoming more sharply divided as corporate profits skyrocket and wages flatline. The top 20% of Australian households own 63% of household wealth. The bottom fifth owns 1%, just 1%. You know you've got a problem when the International Monetary Fund are starting to ask questions. And of course, we know that it's these conditions that generate grievance. We know that it's these conditions in which racism thrives and when hard-right populist governments get a foothold. It's why Donald Trump happens. The status quo is driving inequality and it's degrading our environment at an ever-increasing rate. Australia's carbon pollution is rising at a time when it has to fall. Queensland has been clearing land at least as fast as Brazil. A steady stream of news reports tells us how we're polluting our precious waterways and oceans with plastics that will take hundreds, if not thousands of years to break down. Big irrigators are draining the Murray-Darling Basin and they're destroying our agricultural assets in the process. But we don't have to accept the inevitability of wealth inequality or of environmental degradation. We need a new era of reform, an era of bold policies to tackle the rigged system. The Greens have a plan for a government and an economy that works for all of us. Now, it starts with reining in the influence of big business in our democracy. If we want to shift power away from corporations and give it to ordinary people, we need reforms to donations and to lobbying, and we need an effective watchdog that makes sure politicians and other public institutions stick to the rules. As the chair of the Select Committee into Political Donations, I'll have more to say about this in the coming weeks. But it is no wonder that inequality is at record levels when the Coalition and the Labor Party need to consider the interests of their wealthy donor mates ahead of average Australians. When you live in a democracy that's not corrupted by big money, you'll get an economy that serves everyone, not just the wealthy few. Only then will we start to see genuinely progressive taxation, one that raises enough revenue to fund the essential services that we need, the foundations of a decent society: schools, housing, hospitals. But for Australia, just to reach the OECD average, we need to collect $90 billion more each year in tax, just to reach the OECD average. We'll have more to say about tax reform when the budget comes out in May. But in the meantime, if the major parties are looking for more progressive ideas, and progressive taxation in particular, we'd be happy to send through our 2016 election platform. Our economy is rapidly changing, and government has to keep up. We have to continue the conversation that I kicked off last year at this podium about what work will look like in the future when the rise of digital and automated technologies means that up to 5 million existing jobs in this country could be lost within the next 10 years. We have choices to make. We can prop up dying industries like coal mining, or we can use these technological advances to unchain ourselves from ever-increasing work hours for some and underemployment for others. Indeed, let's begin to imagine a future where our needs are met more and more through universal services and exchange, where everybody having a full-time job is not seen necessarily as either possible or indeed desirable, where our social activity grows, and where we get a little closer to the notion of the good life. With the way the nature of work is changing, along with increasing inequality, our current social safety net is outdated. It can't properly support those experiencing underemployment, insecure work and uncertain hours. A modern, flexible and responsive system would increase people's resilience, not marginalise them, and enable them to make a greater contribution to our community and to our economy. That's why we need a universal basic income. We need a universal basic income, or UBI, that ensures everyone has access to an adequate level of income, as well as access to universal social services. That is the foundation of a decent society. A UBI is a bold move towards equality. It epitomises a government which looks after its citizens, in contrast to the old parties who say, just look after yourselves. It's about a government that cares for people in a rapidly changing world. We Greens are proudly arguing for a more active role for government. Today's problems require government to be more interventionist not less. Overhauling our tax system so that it's no longer skewed in favour of older, richer Australians is one intervention. Protecting working people from insecure work, from stagnant wages and the erosion of fundamental rights, that's another form. But we also need the government to intervene in other areas, like the provision of essential services. Banking is a prime example. Banks are now an essential service. You can't have a job or get government support without having a bank account. It's practically impossible. They are the gatekeepers for first home buyers and aspiring small business owners. That's why today the Greens are announcing our plan for a publicly owned bank, a people's bank, that will give ordinary people access to affordable banking services while adding real competition to the banking sector. As the Banking Royal Commission is showing, the only competition between the banks at the moment is in their race to the bottom. The ACCC, indeed the Productivity Commission, they've found lacklustre competition in the mortgage market and signs of oligopoly behaviour, particularly among the Big Four. And of course, what's been the response from government? You blame the customer. It's your fault for not shopping around. A people's bank, along with more support for cooperatives and mutuals, we'll have more to say on that in the future, would inject some real competition into the banking sector. In the face of ongoing misconduct and price gouging, it's time for government to step in and ensure that there's a low-cost banking service backed directly by the RBA that's focused on the everyday savings and mortgage needs of customers. It's a no-frills bank, but this is a bank that is tailored towards ensuring the customers are looked after, not profits maximised. Through the People's Bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia could offer banking services to the Australian public online, via Australia Post branches and other contracted organisations. By offering a no-frills mortgage tracker account to homeowners, people paying off their own home will be able to borrow up to 60% of the value of the property directly from the RBA. The minimum interest rate would be set at 3%, plus approximately 0.5% for the administration costs of contracted service providers. The real interest rate would go up and down depending on the variable cash rate if it rises above 3%, but it will always deliver loans that householders can pay off faster and with significant savings on interest compared to the current offerings of the banks. The People's Bank will give current and future homeowners a much-needed advantage over investors. It will help turn around the long, slow and steady decline in home ownership rates. It will also help stem the flow of lazy profits to the banks and inject some real competition in the banking sector. What we need is competition between different banking models. We know the competition within the sector as it stands is not working. It's the only way we can force the banks to start providing a public benefit instead of distorting the economy, maximising profits and loading up the financial system with risk. We have a housing crisis in this country, one that has been fuelled by government policy. Now's the time for government to step in. It does this through a People's Bank. It does it by ending policies skewed in favour of investors and speculators like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. And it does it through a massive injection of funds for social and public housing. Now, nothing illustrates the need for government intervention more than climate change. For decades, we've been told that we should trust the market to decide the most efficient way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by putting a price on carbon. Pricing carbon may well be the most cost-effective way of lowering climate pollution over the long term, and we are very proud of our work to negotiate with the Gillard government on a carbon price. But the science is telling us now we need a rapid transition. The scientists are telling us we are facing a climate emergency. We simply won't achieve what's necessary if we have a price on pollution that's too low, if vast sectors of the economy are carved out, or if we fail to monitor these schemes effectively. Of course, we continue to support a price on pollution, but the prospect of an effective carbon price in the current parliament is almost non-existent, and we simply can't afford to have another 2 decades of slow progress. Politics, as usual, has failed us, and we've reached the point where we can't waste any more time. It's time for government to step in, to intervene, to recognise the enormity of the challenge ahead of us. That's why the Greens have introduced legislation not only to prevent governments from propping up ageing, dirty clunkers like the Liddell Power Station, but also to phase out all coal-fired power generation by 2030. No government can say it's got a plan to tackle climate change while it allows coal to continue, or unbelievably, as we've heard in recent years, to expand. Or sorry, recent days, to expand. It's also why we're proposing to renationalise parts of Australia's electricity system, starting with the critical interconnectors between states. It's why we're exploring the notion of a government energy retailer to compete in a re-regulated retail energy market with no frills, easy to understand policies, which can't be changed on you without your knowledge, transparent pricing, and best of all, cheaper energy bills. And it's why we've announced our plan to phase out the sale of petrol cars by 2030 to bring electric vehicles into the market. Government intervention now is the only pathway by which we will transition fast enough away from a centralised, polluting energy system to one that's designed around distributed renewable energy and storage. This is exciting stuff. Huge opportunities here. Job creation and investment. We should be leading the world on this. And of course, beyond the energy space, there are tens and thousands of jobs in the conservation economy, if only government was prepared to step in. Jobs that can help ensure that we have a just transition for people working in the coal industry. Now, I know Matt Canavan doesn't like that term, he finds it objectionable, but what we find objectionable is his government's failure to plan for the future. This change is coming. It's up to us whether we look after people through this transition. There are jobs in restoring and protecting nature and threatened species. There are jobs in rehabilitating mine sites. And there are jobs in a functioning Australian recycling industry. Indeed, recycling is a case study in government failure. An industry that employs 50,000 people is in crisis, and the federal government has been asleep at the wheel. It's allowed the entire industry to be built upon exports to China, and now we've seen that market collapse. We need government to step in to lead and drive the local industry so that our recycling doesn't end up in landfill. We need policies like mandatory product stewardship across a much wider range of products and a commitment from the federal government to buy recycled. Now, my colleague Senator Whish-Wilson is going to have more to say about this in the future, including a proposal for a CEFC-style funding model for a local recycling industry here in Australia. Good for jobs, good for the environment. Government's traditionally been at the centre of providing universal health and education services. But even here, what we're seeing is this shift to a privatised, two-tiered model. We're moving away from that central principle of universality. In education, needs-based funding has been hopelessly compromised. Both the old parties say that they're committed to needs-based sector-blind funding, but then we hear about special deals and carve-outs, like Labor giving the Catholic sector the right to spend billions of dollars in public money wherever it sees fit. They are doubling down on disadvantage at a time when the gap between the rich and poor is widening And do you know who suffers? It's public schools, and it's children in those public schools that suffer. Now, we Greens, we take a different view. We are the party of public education. Our policy follows the evidence by putting the money where the need is, not where the votes are. Public money needs to go to where it's most needed, and that's to public schools first. We are the only party that says that not 1 cent should flow from Treasury to Trinity's boat sheds. We're seeing the same thing in health. In healthcare, the private health insurance rebate sees $6.5 billion of taxpayer money flow to private health insurers every year. And that number is growing. What it does is it puts us on the path to the US system, a two-tiered privatised system where you get one level of healthcare if you can afford private health insurance and a second-rate level of healthcare if you don't. It's time we changed course. Healthcare should be universal, including mental and dental services, mental health and dental services. Imagine going to the dentist, pulling out your Medicare card, just like you do when you go to the doctor. That's our vision for healthcare in this country. Universal healthcare for everybody. What we're talking about here is an overhaul. It's an overhaul of a rigged democracy that benefits the extremely wealthy over the rest of us. We are proudly saying there needs to be a more active role for government, one that's not compromised by its big donors, and one that is willing to step in and put the interests of community and the environment ahead of the rich and powerful. We think that's a very popular vision. And it's this which underpins everything it is to be Greens. Over the past few months, I've had much cause to reflect on the longevity and the power of our movement. What is it that motivates thousands of members and volunteers to spend their evenings and weekends campaigning to elect Greens at a local, state and federal level? It is because we are the only party that puts people and the environment at the centre of everything. As we experience the devastating impacts of climate change and social and economic inequality, as the nature of work changes, this philosophy has never been more important. It's also because we're a constructive voice in the Parliament, improving legislation based on our core values and holding the old captured parties to account. But above all, it's because we are leading the national debate and upending the status quo, championing big, bold, new ideas. New ideas. Those ideas that say it's time to put an end to the trickle-down hoax and to start championing a more active role for government as the foundation for a decent society. Thanks so much.
Well, Richard Di Natale. Thank you very much for your address this afternoon. Can I go to the People's Bank idea firstly? A number of issues with this, one being potential conflict of interest that when the Commonwealth Bank was split from the Reserve Bank back in the 1960s, that was the point to try and avoid the conflict of the central bank setting monetary policy, also being a lender in the market. But I just want to go to something the Reserve Bank has been warning a lot about recently, and that is household debt being at record levels. We've got a big problem there. People are borrowing too much, I'm sure you'd agree. If you had a big new player in the market, the Reserve Bank undercutting the existing banks with cheap loans, what would that do? Wouldn't we see more people taking on extreme amounts of debt, pushing up property prices as well? What would be the impact in terms of debt?
So I think you need to look at all of the factors that are contributing to this increase in household debt and to lending. One of them is that we have a set of mechanisms that incentivise people to buy their second, third and fourth property. When you've got policies like negative gearing in place and you've got big discounts to capital gains tax, you've got a set of inflationary policies. And the Greens, as I said, have championed reforms to end negative gearing and to abolish the capital gains tax discount. That is going to be much more significant in terms of the marketplace, getting investors out and giving priority to people buying properties they're going to live in. Now, you ask, what does it do for somebody who's looking to enter the housing market and move into their first home? It makes their loan more affordable. It means they're not competing with speculators and investors. It means that they get access to an affordable rate of interest, and we don't end up with the situation we've seen in 2016, $42 billion in pre-tax profits from the big four banks. It's like 3% of our GDP. That's a lot of dead money that could be spent on infrastructure, that could be spent on health and education and protecting the environment. We have to decide what we want our banks to do. We want a safe, secure, stable banking environment, but we want it at its heart to be motivated by its interests towards consumers and not making super profits. And that's what we've got at the moment. And that has led to a toxic culture within the banks. We're seeing that through the Banking Royal Commission. We're seeing price gouging. We're seeing unscrupulous behaviour. It's about